Well, I'd like to thank Peter Easton and the organisers of this 2021 CARE conference. As someone who has had a little involvement in working with some of our speakers for the conference, I look back on the fact that a little over 12 months ago, we thought we'd be on Heron Island off the Queensland coast on one of the world's great natural wonders, the Barrier Reef. But circumstances meant that wasn't possible. But it's really fantastic to have the conference proceeding the way that it is this year on what is a really important topic, which is essentially reporting on sustainability and particularly around climate risk. Now, what I wanted to do was just talk a little bit wearing my, not just my academics hat, but my hat as a member of the Australian Accounting Standards Board on what the role is of standards in reporting, and in particular to highlight the need of what I see as research opportunities. One of the great things about CARE conferences is that it's not just a bunch of academics standing up presenting research papers. It's always a mixture of people from the academic world as well as the world of practice talking about and identifying research opportunities. So I hope I can do that as well here. And I will stress, though, that the views that I'm going to express are obviously mine and mine alone, and they're not representative of the Australian Accounting Standards Board. Well, why do we need standards for sustainability reporting? Well, fundamentally, we know that the disclosures that we see arise in one of two ways. They're either voluntary or they're a response in some form to some type of mandatory requirement. Now, obviously, voluntary disclosure represents the operation of a market. It reflects the demand for information and the factors that also influence its supply. And we know from an extensive body of academic research that increased disclosure and transparency is rewarded by capital markets. For example, we know that there are links between disclosure and the cost of capital. Now, voluntary disclosure also probably is a very important way in which we see innovation in the way that information is made available to users, and also possibly innovation in the way that things get measured. Now, I'll just use as an example of that the growth that's occurred over the last 20 years or so in non-GAAP reporting by listed firms. But voluntary disclosure also means that there's not necessarily a standard basis, either in terms of how something is measured or indeed on whether it's even disclosed. There's really no baseline in either respect. And of course, one of the worries about that situation where something may or may not be disclosed and it may or may not be measured a certain way is that one possible explanation for those decisions is opportunism on the part of management and the board of directors. So it could be opportunistic rather than informative disclosure. And I'm sure accountants will recognise that that's much the debate, for example, that has arisen over reporting non-GAAP measures of performance. So the fact that there are these competing explanations, these competing interpretations sometimes of voluntary disclosure is one possible reason as to why we observe the development of reporting standards. So one thing that would be really useful to have in terms of making good decisions around standards for reporting issues in areas such as climate change would be to have a good understanding of what market failures really give rise to potentially opportunistic or opaque or absent disclosures that are otherwise deemed to be important. Now, the second thing I wanted to touch on is the challenge of trying to work out what the purpose of having a set of reporting standards is. Now, we know that accounting standards have an overriding objective that's something like useful information for investors, just depending on whether you look at the IASB conceptual framework or the FASB version. That's sort of the general idea, useful information for investors. And we also know that there are other attributes of accounting information that are deemed as important contributors to having information that's useful for investors. So we've got attributes like comparability, verifiability, timeliness, and understandability. So those things reflect a framework for developing reporting rules. But how helpful would a framework like that be for developing useful standards for sustainability reporting? Now, financial reporting standards pretty much have a singular purpose, that useful information for investors idea. And that really isn't up for much debate. People accept that, I think. But when we talk about developing a framework that would help us to build a set of standards for reporting in areas such as climate risk, just to use one example, whose overarching objective would apply there? Would it be the objective of investors, which presumably is a value maximisation argument? Or would it be the objectives of other interest groups? And those objectives of other interest groups could be very different from value maximisation. Now, when we look at the debate that's gone on in the financial community over the last few years over broadening concepts of who stakeholders are, for example, and in particular the debate around the development of a so-called broader corporate purpose, we can see how these things really muddy the answer to what the overarching objective of a set of disclosure rules addressing something like climate risk would be. So multiple objectives, multiple interests among different groups of stakeholders mean that it's going to be hard to work out what the overarching objective really is. So a precursor to setting standards is to decide what they really need to measure and to whom they're actually directed. So we need an evidence-based approach in that respect. We need to actually have evidence that helps us work out what the key constructs and measures really are. And then we need agreement on how to demonstrate that these things matter. The analogy I'm thinking of there is, for example, literature that shows that certain voluntary disclosures are associated with a lower cost of capital. But what the disclosure would be and what the objective of the disclosure is, and hence what the benefit should be, is something that I think we really have to think hard about and represents a real opportunity for the academic community to contribute to that debate. Well, just to go one step further on that point, what is it that we actually want to report or measure? Now, broadly speaking, I think what we're interested in is in what I call environmental, social, and governance attributes or performance. So ESG issues. Now, obviously, climate risk is one part of that bigger box of ESG issues. But when I was reading just one report from one ESG-focused investment management house in Australia, these were the topics that I was able to identify that they deemed to be important: sustainability, modern slavery, climate risk, social diversity, biodiversity, water risks, human rights. Now, my point isn't to sort of demonstrate just how many areas of interest there potentially are. My point here is that a very diverse range of stakeholders potentially wants a very diverse range of information. And in fact, even existing organisations that presumably specialise at measuring ESG attributes or ESG performance seem to disagree. There's already quite a bit of academic evidence that shows, I think, a surprisingly low correlation between the ESG measures from major suppliers of that information. And that research helps us understand that the low correlation between those different measures reflects differences in their scope, in their measurement, and in the weights which are attached to various subcomponents. So when the major suppliers of information in this space produce measures that clearly do not capture exactly the same thing, and there are clear differences, that really gives rise to pause in thinking about how easy it is or how difficult really it's going to be to have ESG reporting standards that are independent of value judgments about corporate actions and ultimately capital flows, because clearly people's focus in this broad space tends to be quite different. Now, we already know that there are a lot of standard setters out there, or organisations that in various ways are contributing towards establishing various forms of reporting measures and benchmarks. And I've listed just a few on that slide. The Global Reporting Initiative, the International Integrated Reporting Council, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board obviously has done a lot of work in this space. And of course, much of what we currently see comes from the pioneering work done by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. But interestingly, one recent initiative is a proposal by the IFRS Foundation to establish its own Sustainability Reporting Standards Board. Now, how would that work? Would the infrastructure and standard setting knowledge that an organisation like the IFRS Foundation has already gathered in terms of accounting standards, would that in fact be a good way to progress the reporting of sustainability issues? Some people see it, I guess, as a bit like the prisoners being put in charge of the prison, because they see the perspective, the framework that applies to the development of accounting standards as being very different from a possible framework that would apply to the development of sustainability reporting standards. But that goes back to the issue I mentioned earlier. What really are the objectives, and what should the framework look like that would guide the development of reporting standards? So the key point here is that the fact that there's a diversity of standards and a diversity of regulators, that's a huge opportunity for academic research. Although obviously it's not without significant challenges as well in terms of actually getting the data, working out what it is we're trying to measure, and also understanding how we can demonstrate genuine causal linkages between various measures and various effects associated with differences in those measures. One last point I'd like to make is that there's a tremendous opportunity in the assurance space, because apart from deciding what should be reported, there's also the issue of how it should be assured. Now, the accounting research literature has a long tradition of demonstrating that various properties of accounting information are quite strongly linked to indicators of assurance, such as proxies for audit quality. But we actually don't know very much about the assurance of information beyond accounting information. In fact, if you look through the accounting research literature, there are a surprisingly small number of studies that consider how, for example, the conventional indicators of assurance quality by auditors is associated with attributes of information beyond the core accounting numbers. So one of the big questions that's going to arise is whether or not ESG or sustainability disclosures can actually be assured. If they're not, for example, how useful will they be? Of course, that presumes some definition of useful, which, as I indicated before, is obviously a significant challenge. So there's a real opportunity, I think, for academic researchers to contribute to the development of reporting standards, not just in terms of what those standards might look like, but also how those standards would have credibility and how they would therefore be a source of information to various forms of stakeholders who are interested in the measures that would result. So just to conclude, the environment we find ourselves in at the moment, we have changing expectations about what firms should report, about how they should report information, who they should report it to, disagreement about how standards should be developed, who should develop those standards, what sort of assurance is needed, and who should be responsible for providing that assurance. So there is a tremendous diversity of view at the moment that really lends itself to both analytical and empirical research that can help us understand what the answers to these questions should be. Obviously, most of these issues are shaped ultimately by questions about what is ultimately a productive or even desirable investment activity. For example, is it desirable that as a community we make certain sorts of investment decisions, or we do not make certain sorts of investment decisions? So one thing that seems reasonably apparent is that it's quite unlikely that the traditional economic framework that underlies most of what we do in accounting and finance is going to offer all the answers. We're going to need the knowledge of people from outside that traditional space to help us develop high quality research that addresses answers about these broader reporting issues. We know what the traditional accounting model looks like. We know why it exists, and we know what sort of decisions it serves. But as the focus of this conference demonstrates, reporting around areas of sustainability and broader ESG issues goes a long way beyond that.